Stop for a moment, breathe, and listen carefully, because this message is not random, and it is not here by accident. The moment you stopped waiting, something shifted deep inside them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that shook the foundation of everything they believed was safe. They didn't realize it at first. They thought you were just busy. They assumed you would come back like you always did. They believed your silence was temporary. They believed your patience had no end. But then something happened. You stopped explaining. You stopped reaching out. You stopped filling the empty spaces they created. And that is when their world began to collapse. Not because you left, but because you emotionally detached. And psychologically, that is far more terrifying. You see, when someone believes you will always wait, they build their identity around that certainty. Your presence becomes a background constant, something they don't consciously appreciate, but subconsciously depend on. Carl Jung spoke deeply about this. When a person unconsciously relies on another for emotional stability, that person becomes part of their psychological structure. Not love, not devotion, but dependence disguised as comfort. And comfort is dangerous, because comfort creates blindness. They grew comfortable in knowing you would wait, comfortable knowing you would forgive, comfortable knowing you would stay emotionally available, even when they gave you very little in return. They did not fear losing you. They feared inconvenience. They feared confrontation. They feared effort. But they never feared absence. Until now, the moment you stopped waiting, the rules changed. Your energy withdrew. Your reactions softened. Your emotional availability faded. And suddenly, they could feel it. Not in words, not in logic, but in the body. Something was missing. You were no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. And that is when panic began, not on the surface, but in the shadow. Jung called this shadow activation. When something we have taken for granted is removed, the unconscious panics before the conscious mind understands why. They started replaying conversations, rereading old messages, analyzing your tone, checking your silence for meaning. Not because they suddenly became emotionally intelligent, but because their sense of control was gone. You see, when you were waiting, the power dynamic was clear. They decided the pace. They decided the effort. They decided when to show up, and you adjusted. But now, you stopped adjusting, and that shattered the illusion. The unconscious mind hates uncertainty, and you became uncertain. They started feeling it late at night, in quiet moments, when distraction faded and truth crept in. Questions began to rise, questions they had never allowed themselves to ask before. What if they're done? What if I pushed too far? What if I assumed too much? What if I waited too long? These thoughts didn't come gently. They arrived like cracks in a wall they believed was permanent. You see, they never believed you would leave emotionally. They believed you were anchored to them. But when you stopped waiting, you became free. And freedom is terrifying to someone who benefited from your patience. Here is something most people don't understand. People don't panic when they lose someone physically. They panic when they lose access. Access to your attention. Access to your emotional labor. Access to your reassurance. Access to your presence. When you stopped waiting, you didn't announce it. You didn't threaten. You didn't beg. You simply shifted. And that silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Your calm scared them more than your anger ever did. Because anger means you still care. Calm means you've accepted something. And acceptance comes right before release. They felt it in your responses. Shorter, neutral, less emotionally charged. You were no longer seeking validation, no longer asking for clarity, no longer trying to fix what they refused to maintain. And this is where their world truly began to collapse. Because now, they were the ones waiting. waiting for a reply, waiting for reassurance, waiting for proof that they still mattered. And suddenly, the silence was on the other side. This reversal creates a psychological shock. Jung described it as the ego losing its mirror. They were used to seeing themselves reflected in your attention, in your patience, in your emotional availability. When you stopped waiting, the mirror disappeared, and they were left alone with themselves, with their choices, with their delays, with their assumptions. This is when regret begins, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, heavy kind. The kind that sits in the chest, the kind that tightens the stomach, the kind that doesn't leave easily. They started remembering things they ignored before. Your consistency, your loyalty, your emotional effort, not because those things suddenly became valuable, but because they were suddenly absent. The mind only understands value when loss appears possible. And now, loss was no longer theoretical. It felt real. They noticed your independence, your emotional distance, your calm detachment, and that terrified them, because your power no longer depended on them. You were no longer waiting to be chosen. And that is when their whole internal structure began to shake. They wanted to reach out, to say something, to do something, but pride stopped them. Fear of rejection stopped them. Fear that you might no longer respond the same way stopped them. So instead, they watched, from the shadows, observing, overthinking, silently panicking. The irony is this: they became emotionally invested only after you emotionally withdrew. And that realization hits hard, because deep down, they know the truth. If you had not stopped waiting, they would not have changed. And that knowledge is unbearable. This is only the beginning, because once the unconscious wakes up, it does not go back to sleep. And what comes next is the unexpected action, because what happened after you stopped waiting was not random. It was psychological, it was unconscious, and it was inevitable. The silence you created did not just confuse them. It activated fear, not the fear of losing love, but the fear of losing control. You see, when someone knows you will always be there, they relax into entitlement. They stop showing up fully. They stop being careful. They stop investing emotionally, not because they don't care, but because the unconscious assumes permanence. Carl Jung explained this clearly. When the ego believes something is guaranteed, it stops valuing it consciously. It moves the attachment into the shadow, and the shadow only wakes up when there is threat. Your silence became that threat. At first, they rationalized it. You're busy. You're emotional. You'll come back. But then, time passed, and you didn't. You didn't chase. You didn't ask. You didn't explain. And suddenly, the nervous system reacted. Their body noticed before their mind did. Sleep became restless. Focus dropped. Anxiety appeared without a clear reason. Because the unconscious knew something, the conscious mind was still denying. You were no longer waiting, and that created loss of emotional safety. Here's the truth most people never realize. Silence is not absence. Silence is withdrawal of emotional supply. You stopped feeding the dynamic that kept them comfortable. No reassurance, no emotional labor, no constant availability. And this is where panic begins, because now they had to sit with themselves, with their own thoughts, with their own guilt, with their own unfinished emotions. You were no longer buffering their inner emptiness, and that scared them. They began checking their phone more often, rereading old conversations, looking for clues, not because they missed you romantically, but because their sense of certainty collapsed. You had become unpredictable, and unpredictability is terrifying to the ego. They didn't know if you still cared. They didn't know if they still mattered. They didn't know if they could still reach you emotionally. This uncertainty activated attachment anxiety, especially if they were avoidant. Avoidant people fear closeness, but they fear abandonment even more. They want distance, but only when they control it. When you created the distance, it broke their inner balance. Now they were the ones waiting for you to respond, waiting for reassurance, waiting for proof they hadn't lost you. And here is where the collapse truly happens. They began imagining life without you, not in a dramatic way, but in quiet flashes, moments where they realized, you won't be there to listen anymore. You won't be there to understand. You won't be there to soften their loneliness. And that realization felt like a hollow ache. This is when regret forms. Not regret for hurting you, but regret for taking you for granted. They remembered your patience, your emotional generosity, your loyalty. Things they once ignored now felt irreplaceable. And the worst part? They knew they caused this. They knew they delayed too long. They knew they assumed too much. They knew they underestimated your strength. But instead of immediately reaching out, they froze. Because now there was risk. Risk that you might not respond. Risk that you might not care. Risk that you might be done. And ego hates vulnerability. So they stayed silent, but watched closely. From the shadows, they noticed how you changed. Your independence, your calm, your emotional neutrality. You were no longer emotionally reactive. And that terrified them. Because emotional reactions mean influence. And you were no longer influenced by them. Your silence wasn't empty. It was full of self-respect. And that exposed something uncomfortable. They realized they were no longer your priority. You had shifted your focus inward, toward your peace, toward your growth. And that created a power reversal. They were no longer the center of your emotional world. And that is when their world truly began to collapse. Because people who rely on being needed panic when they are no longer necessary. They started feeling jealousy even if no one else was present. They started feeling possessive even without proof. They started feeling urgency without knowing what to do. Their unconscious screamed, act now or lose them. But fear still held them back. Fear of rejection, fear of humiliation, fear of facing the consequences. So they stayed stuck between action and paralysis. And this internal conflict created pressure. Pressure builds, and pressure always releases, which leads to the next phase, the unexpected action. But before that happens, you must understand something important. Their panic does not automatically mean growth. Fear can mimic love. Urgency can mimic commitment. Regret can mimic change. And that is why what comes next must be observed carefully, because the action they take will reveal the truth. There is a moment most people don't see. It happens quietly, after the panic, after the sleepless nights, after the endless replaying of your silence. This is the moment where the mind stops denying and starts calculating. They don't ask, do I miss them? They ask, what if they're really gone? And that question changes everything. Because now the fear is no longer emotional. It becomes existential. You see, your absence forced them to confront a truth they had avoided. You were not waiting because you were weak. You were waiting because you chose to. And now that choice was gone. This realization creates a split inside them. One part wants to reach out immediately, to apologize, to confess, to pull you back. The other part is terrified. Terrified of hearing nothing. Terrified of seeing how much you've changed. Terrified of realizing they are no longer special to you. So they hesitate. And hesitation creates tension. That tension is unbearable. This is where the unexpected move is born. But it rarely looks the way you imagine. They don't always come directly. Instead, they test. They like your post. They watch your stories. They ask about you through others. They show up where you might notice them. Not because they're confident, but because they're scared. They want to feel you first, before risking rejection. This is the ego protecting itself. Carl Jung described this as projection under threat. When the ego feels it's losing an attachment, it sends signals instead of truth. Why? Because truth requires vulnerability. And vulnerability means admitting, I misjudged you. I assumed you would stay. I was wrong. That admission is heavy, so they circle you instead. They want proof you still feel something. They want confirmation you're still emotionally available. They want reassurance without asking for it. And here's where it gets dangerous for them. Because you are no longer the same person. You are not responding the way you used to. You are not rewarding half effort. You are not feeding uncertainty. Your calm creates confusion. They expected anger. They expected sadness. They expected a reaction. But you gave them nothing. And nothing is terrifying. Because nothing means no access, no control, no influence. This is when the pressure spikes. They begin romanticizing the past. Not the relationship, but the version of you that loved them unconditionally. They remember moments they ignored, words they brushed aside, warnings they didn't take seriously. And suddenly, you are no longer replaceable. You become symbolic. You represent stability, emotional safety, understanding, things they didn't value until they disappeared. This is when they consider doing something drastic, a message, a confession, an apology they've rehearsed 100 times in their head. But right before they send it, fear stops them again. Because what if you've moved on? What if someone else now occupies the space they once took for granted? That thought creates jealousy, even without evidence. And jealousy creates urgency. Their heart races. Their thoughts spiral. They imagine you laughing with someone else, building something new, choosing someone who chose you back. And that image hurts more than losing you quietly. So now they are trapped. Do nothing and slowly lose you, or act and risk losing you instantly. This internal battle changes them. They become emotionally unstable, hot and cold, interested but distant, present but not fully there, because their ego and their fear are fighting. And here is the most important thing you must understand. The unexpected move does not come from love. It comes from loss of identity. They didn't just lose you. They lost the version of themselves who felt secure because you were there. Your absence exposed how much they relied on you emotionally, and that realization is humiliating. So when they finally act, and they will act, it won't be graceful. It will be awkward, delayed, emotionally loaded. Sometimes it's a late-night message. Sometimes it's a sudden emotional confession. Sometimes it's pretending nothing happened and trying to reconnect casually. But underneath all of it is one truth. They are afraid you no longer need them. And that fear changes everything. Because once someone realizes they are no longer needed, they either evolve or they collapse further. And what they do next will tell you which path they choose.